This class is on the business planning process. It's part 2 of 3 classes on the same topic. Because it's such a long video, a long class I should say, it's wise to stop the video from time to time, make your own notes and move the video forwards and backwards as required, and also pad out your notes from your own researches. Go online, check the topic, see if you can find some reading on it, as well as some of the PDFs that we include in the classes here. Now, to continue from what was in part 1, we'll move on with this video, which starts with management and objectives. First of all, the importance of objectives in the planning process. And we'll start with targets. These are specific goals or targets and are essential to give focus to the process. So there's a plan. The plan is aiming at something. It must be aiming at something. That something is called a target, realistically enough. So it's a specific outcome that's required in the future. So it's the focus of the planning process. The set of objectives versus the achieved outcomes is a measure of success, or indeed a failure, of the planning process. These are measuring sticks. In other words, how successful was the activity in achieving the outcomes that were set in the plan? If the project didn't achieve them, there's possibly 2 explanations. One, that the objectives set out in the plan were not realistic. The plan was bad. Or secondly, there was inefficiency or inability, for whatever reason, on the part of the managers to achieve those objectives. But one way or the other, we have measuring sticks. We have a way of measuring performance against the plan. Objectives also include this idea of commitment. The objectives must be realistic and achievable. If they're achievable and realistic, this will engender commitment on the part of the staff to pursue the objectives actively. They must be achievable. If they're not achievable, people won't even try to achieve this. If they're not achievable, there's no point in even setting out to try to achieve them. They must be realistic and achievable. And those involved in the process must be motivated. They must see it as a challenge, and they must truly attempt to achieve the objectives set out. They must be motivated to do that. And there is something called management by objectives. This involves a detailed and integrated management system based on set objectives. So management by objectives is the objectives are set out and the management try to achieve the objectives. Management by objective. It encourages participation and engagement based on measurable set of objectives. So management by objective is one way to approach looking at management and what motivates management and what drives management. So management by objectives may be one way of doing it. Set out the objectives and get the management to achieve those. We should also look at ends, means, priorities. The ends, mean chain of ends, the means, ends, chain of objectives. There are too many S's in that statement. Objectives should be ranked according to importance. There's no point in aiming at something minor, so it's important to identify the big objective and try to achieve it. However, sometimes lower objectives must be achieved before the higher ones. this is often the case in business, that something must go before something else. Of course, it's almost a matter of debate then as to which one is the more important. If one is a prerequisite for the other, then priorities may have been turned on their head. But whatever, the point is that care and attention must ensure that the objectives are in the right sequence. That's the point. Objectives must be ordered according to their priority. And if one is a prerequisite to the next, then it must come before the next. Otherwise, that chain is broken. So, in terms of priorities, well, priorities organize a to-do list of objectives according to importance. Clearly, important and critical priorities demand more and immediate attention. But we can see priorities as it's like a to-do list, what needs to be done. And they can be ranked. So let's say number one, priority number one is to do this first. As to whether that's the most important or not, it depends. But generally speaking, if it's up at number one, it's a prerequisite for the others. It goes before the others and deserves its position as number one. So priorities rank tasks according to their importance, and they must be achieved in sequence. There's something called the ABC priority system. A is must-do objectives. These are critical to success or to a successful performance. So A is must-do. B, should do. They're necessary for improved performance. So they improve what is already there. And C is nice to do. Objectives that are desirable but not critical for survival or improved performance. They're just, it would be nice to have them in place, but they are not actually critical. So priorities are, within the ABC priority system, is must do, should do, and nice to do. Must do being obviously the more important one. There's also the so-called 80-20 principle put forward by Pareto. Pareto as a thinker back in the 1930s, an Italian thinker in the 1930s. The 80-20 principle, known as the 80-20 rule, or the law of the vital few, or the principle of factor scarcity. This states that for many events, roughly 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. So if it's possible to identify the 20% that's causing the 80%, clearly they are priorities. So identifying the priorities according to this rule is identifying which priority has the biggest impact, and then which next priority has the next biggest impact, and working the way through the priorities to achieve the objectives that way. So the Pareto principle, the top 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. Try to identify those causes, and those become the critical priorities that must be achieved first. The planning and control cycle. Well, the planning and control cycle, this framework sets out the core objectives and a timescale for the business. It incorporates control functions to guide and monitor activities for deviations from plans. So once the plan is in position, any deviation should be flagged up through control functions. In other words, management should spot that the plan is going off the rails and corrective action needs to be taken. Control functions, which is monitoring and communications, tries to achieve the objectives as set out in the plan. So the control functions try to keep the plan on course. And this is particularly important if something comes along to knock off the plan off course and will require management intervention to try and correct for that. The planning process may use feedback from controls to improve or alter the plans and implement corrective actions where necessary. Good planning may involve feedback mechanisms. In other words, at the end of a stage, feedback is sought, and based on the feedback, some corrective action can be taken to ensure it doesn't happen next time round. So feedback is very important as a way of ensuring that the plan is correct and that the processes are correct and that the two are synchronized and the plan can go forward. So any issues, any adverse issues in particular, can be fed back through questionnaires, through comments, through meetings, whatever. These feedbacks can then be used to alter the plan, perhaps, make it more realistic, or to make some modification to it, or indeed modify the actual process itself, because the feedback has highlighted some inefficiency or some irregularity in the process. Now, the basic planning and control cycle. Well, in the planning phase, formulate the plans. Then, reasonably enough, implement the plan. Monitor deviations from the plan. And in the control phase, correct variations from the plan. That's the idea of the control phase. To take the feedback, or to take comments, or whatever it is, or observations, to take those and compare the actual performance with the planned performance and correct any variation. So corrective action may be taken to the plan, and it goes back into the implementation of the plan again, monitor deviations from the plan, control phase, and that's a possible loop. That one may continue to run. However, if it continuously requires change and there is constant corrections, then it may be the plan needs updating. So something must give. We also have this idea called synergy. This is the concept that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. In economies of scale, in economics, sometimes people say 1 + 1 = 3. That where you have something and something else, the combined output of the two of them is bigger than each of them separately. Economies of scale is dealt with in a separate video. But for example, production components, machinery administration, other various functions need to be synchronized to optimize efficiency. So it's possible to have synergy, putting things together, putting resources together so as to get a bigger output or a bigger outcome than if the individual components worked alone. So when all of the functions fit smoothly together, that's when synergy happens. When everything clicks into place, everything works neatly, one after the other. When everything in the plan works out perfectly and everything fits together, that's when there is synergy. Now the types of synergy, well, there's market synergy, placing existing products in new markets. There's a synergy because there's no research and development, there's no development costs in fact at all, because it's an existing product. It's just placed in a new market. So they're looking for synergy or similarities and the ability of the new market to accept the product that was perhaps successful in the previous market. So the two markets are linked because the product perhaps is successful in both. So placing an existing product in a new market, it gets rid of research and development, it gets rid of the uncertainty associated with a totally new product, and it just places the product in a new market. Cost synergy, well, savings from combinations of common based operations, resources and facilities, e.g. warehousing, buying, distribution and some administrative functions. If a business has a product running and it's working in the market, then it will, the chances are, have some sort of warehousing for that product, if it's a physical product. It'll have warehousing, it'll have a buying function, distribution, it may have a fleet of lorries or vans. It'll have some administrative function. Now bringing in a second product means that any slack available in warehousing, buying, distribution or administration, any slack, any underutilization there could be used for the second product. That's when there is synergy. It's a cost saving. Technological synergy. The transfer and application of existing technologies to new products and markets. Putting it simply, a company may innovate a certain product. It may have an existing product in the market which is perhaps successful, but it innovates the product, and in so doing it finds that there is a second product that may be produced as a spin-off effect. And the existing technology for the first product could be used for the second product. That's a technological synergy, the two parts fitting together. There's also management synergy. There are core functions within the business. Looking at marketing, for example, and looking at the product range. Marketing, once it's in place, once the marketing structure is set up, marketing teams are formed and product managers are in place and so on, it may be easier, much easier to introduce a second product and again use any spare capacity within the existing framework. Or indeed, if it has to be expanded, it'll be easier to expand than set up from new. So there is a management synergy as well. So synergy, looking for efficiencies through coordinating resources in this way, is very important, and it has this nice name of synergy. Michael Porter introduced generic competitive strategies. So the competitive variables in Porter's view for the planning, well, competitive advantage. The plans should show how to compete in selected markets and what advantages the business has in that context. So the planning framework should emphasize or should bring out this competitive advantage. Clearly, if there isn't a competitive advantage, it doesn't look good right from the start. In fact, it doesn't look good at all. So competitive advantage is important, and Porter emphasized that one. There's also something called competitive scope. The plan should specify, with justification, the extent of the market that should be targeted. Introducing perhaps a new product into the market doesn't mean it's going to overlap completely with a previous product. It might be aiming at a different segment of the market, or it might be aimed at a certain locality, not the whole country, just a certain area. Depends. So defining the scope of the marketing effort and looking at the competitive scope that's envisaged is important. So there are two parts when we talk about competitive. The word competitive fits neatly with both of those. There's also something called the cost leadership strategy. The cost leadership strategy in Porter's framework is Some companies, for whatever reason, are cheaper at producing products than others, so they have a cost advantage. And if they're cheaper at producing it, then they can lower the price if they wish. But essentially what it leads to is that they lead the market. The other firms follow them. No one wants to upset them, because if they upset them and they cut the price, it'll force the competitors out of the market. So the other companies take what's left over. So some companies have a cost price leadership. It's an efficient and low cost base, and it should provide a competitive advantage in pricing over the competitors. And there should be a differentiation strategy. A commitment to research and development and innovation may provide a unique product and superior value for the customer that builds brand loyalty. So some companies develop a reputation for building brand loyalty. You've only got to think of some of the computer companies, Apple, Google and so on. So they have a certain brand loyalty because they have large research and development commitments, and customers like the product that's the outcome of this research and development, so they become loyal to that particular brand. There should also be, under the same heading, we've now got, I think this is the fourth one under the heading, cost-focused strategy. The plan may emphasize cost control as a means to gaining competitive advantage or competitive edge in the market segment, and it could lead to dominance in the segment. Firms that are very conscious of cost control tend to be the ones who last. So they monitor their costs. They have an ability to, as a consequence, lower price if need be. But certainly the other firms in the segment must follow them, because they are the ones who are seen as the most efficient. So they may lead to dominance in the segment. In other words, they become the chief business in that area, and the competitors follow them and copy them, depending on whether they've got intellectual property rights or not. The last one from Porter's generic competitive strategies is focused differentiation. This involves attempting to achieve a competitive edge to a small segment of the market. It's focused. It's not the whole market, it's just focused on some aspect of the market, some part of the market. It may rely on branding or reputation and the perception of superior quality, but it's not aiming at the whole market, it's aiming at some segment of the market. Car manufacturers, for example. Some car manufacturers do not target the whole market, they only target some part of the market. High-end sports car manufacturers, they're not targeting everyone, they're just targeting certain people. The luxury car end, which runs to very few producers, but those are not targeting everyone. The cost of the car would be prohibitive for most people. So they're not targeting most people, they're only targeting certain parts of the market. And they rely on their brand, the reputation, and also the perception of superior quality. So these are Porter's generic competitive strategies. Now that completes this part. This is part 2 of a 3-part talk on planning. So that's the second part, and that concludes it. So thank you for watching.